There is a clay tablet in room 55 of the British Museum that most visitors walk past without noticing. It sits in a glass case among the Mesopotamian holdings. A fragment of baked clay, about the size of a human hand, surface, crowded with the wedge marks of cuneiform script. It is one of 7 tablets that together form the text known as the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian and later Babylonian account of how the world came into being. The tablet was excavated from the buried library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in expeditions that began under Henry Layard in the 1840s and continued under Hormuzd Rassam through the 1850s. The physical object dates to approximately 700 BCE. The text it carries is older. It is called the Enuma Elish, proud, and what happened when one researcher decided to take its central event seriously. Not as theological symbolism, but as a description of something people who wrote it believed they had witnessed in the sky, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in comparative ancient studies. The Enuma Elish consists of about 1,000 lines of poetry across its 7 tablets. The clay is baked and broken in places, script is standard Neo-Assyrian cuneiform, and the language is Akkadian, though the underlying tradition is Sumerian. The opening lines describe a time before sky and earth had been named, when the primordial waters of Apsu and Tiamat mingled together. The middle tablets describe a violent encounter between Tiamat, pictured as a vast watery body, and a younger figure named Marduk, who arrives armed and accompanied by what the text calls winds and arrows of lightning. Marduk splits Tiamat in 2. From one half of her body the sky is made, from the other half the earth. Read as creation poetry, this is symbolic, a divine battle dressed in cosmic language. Read another way, it is the description of a celestial event. Body in the sky is struck, broken into 2 halves, and the pieces become 2 new things in their now altered positions. The Akkadian word for sky here is the same word used elsewhere in Mesopotamian astronomical texts for the visible heavenly band. The word for Tiamat shares a root with later Semitic words for deep water and for the abyss. In early Sumerian astronomy, it is also used for a specific region of the sky. The conventional dating of the Enuma Elish as a physical text places it in the late 2nd millennium BCE, with the surviving Ashurbanipal copies inscribed roughly between approximately 700 and 650 BCE. But the event the text describes, the splitting of one celestial body into 2 by the impact of another, is not, in the alternative reading, a metaphor. Zecharia Sitchin, an author and self-trained Semiticist who published The 12th Planet in 1976, argued that the Enuma Elish is the oldest surviving record of an actual collision event in the early solar system. He called it the Celestial Battle. He claimed that the Sumerians had inherited the account from an earlier source, the same event, described in different language, but with the same essential structure. Appears in the founding cosmologies of 4 other Asian civilizations that, at the time the texts were composed, had no demonstrable contact with Sumer or with each other. 4 civilizations are these. The first is the Vedic culture of the Indus and Ganges plains, whose Rigveda, compiled approximately between 1500 and 1200 BCE, contains the hymn of Indra splitting the dragon Vritra. The second is the early Chinese tradition preserved in the Huainanzi and the Shujing, where the goddess Nuwa repairs a sky that has cracked and fallen because a pillar of heaven was broken. Third is the early Japanese tradition, recorded in much later form in the Takenouchi manuscripts, and in elements of the Kojiki, where an ancient celestial parent is wounded and the world rearranges. The fourth is the Korean tradition preserved in the Samguk Yusa, compiled by the Buddhist monk Iryeon around 1281, which dates the founding of the first Korean state, Gojian under Dangun, to 2333 BCE. a date the chronicle ties explicitly to a heavenly descent. The thesis is this: the Enuma Elish records a specific celestial event. 4 other ancient Asian traditions record what appears to be the same event, with the same essential geometry. One body splitting another, fragments redistributed. The sky after the event different from the sky before. The traditions cannot easily have borrowed from one another. The analysis that links them has been challenged in general terms, but no peer-reviewed, counter-reading has accounted for the geometric specificity of the parallel. If you find that the academic literature on ancient creation texts has been incomplete, if you suspect that there are tablets and manuscripts still sitting in museum drawers waiting for someone to read them with fresh eyes, this channel is for that work. Subscribe, only if that's the question you've been looking for. The rest of us continue. The mainstream reading of the Enuma Elish is well established and, on its own terms, internally coherent. It treats the text as a Babylonian state poem composed to elevate the god Marduk over the older Sumerian pantheon. The leading modern translation in English is by Stephanie Dalley, the Oxford Assyriologist, in her Myths from Mesopotamia, first published by Oxford University Press in the late 1980s, and revised since. Earlier translations were made by Stephen Langdon in the early 20th century, and by Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Sumerologist at the University of Pennsylvania, who died in 1990. Text was first published in cuneiform copies by the British Museum's Assyriological staff in the late 19th century. Layard and Rassam shipped the Ashurbanipal library tablets back to London. In the mainstream view, the Enuma Elish is a creation myth in the strict sense, a religious narrative that explains, in symbolic language, why the world has the structure it does, and why one god, rather than another, sits at the top of the divine hierarchy. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is read as a recasting of an older Sumerian conflict between the storm god and the primordial sea. Splitting of Tiamat into sky and earth is read as a poetic image, not a description of an event. The poem's purpose, in this reading, is liturgical. It was recited annually during the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, in the Temple of Marduk in Babylon. The function was political and religious, not historical or astronomical. The mainstream account of cross-cultural parallels is also coherent. Rigveda's Indra splits the dragon Vritra. The standard reading is that both the Indo-European storm god myths and the Mesopotamian storm god myths share a common Proto-Indo-European or pre-Indo-European root, with parallel structures arising from shared mythic logic rather than shared historical memory. Where the Chinese Nuwa repairs a broken sky, the reading is that this is an independent cosmological tradition addressing a universal human anxiety, the fear that the sky might fall, and that the structural similarity is the product of human universals rather than diffusion. Where the Korean Samguk Yusa places Dangun's founding at 2333 BCE, the reading among most academic historians is that this is a much later retrospective date, calculated by medieval monks using Chinese chronological frameworks and not historically reliable, where the Takenouchi manuscripts describe an ancient celestial parent. The mainstream treats these documents as 20th century compositions, or, best, as compilations drawing on much earlier oral traditions but unreliable in their dating. The conventional reading is, in short, the parallels are real at the level of theme, but explicable without recourse to a shared historical event. Storm god myths recur because storms recur, sky-falling myths recur because the night sky is large and human imagination is small, and the same images appear independently. Founding dates are calculated, not remembered. Manuscripts that claim antiquity often turn out to be young. This is a defensible position, Many of the people who hold it have spent their professional lives reading these texts in the original languages. Kramer's work on Sumerian alone runs to dozens of volumes. Daly's translations are careful and conservative. Langdon's edition of the Weld Blundell Prism, held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, set the standard for the careful reading of these dates that subsequent scholars have followed for nearly a century. The mainstream is not foolish. It is, however, working from a set of assumptions that the alternative reading does not share. And once those assumptions are loosened, the same texts begin to look very different. The break in the conventional reading came in its most influential form with Zechariah Sitchin. Sitchin was born in Baku, in what is now Azerbaijan, in 1920, raised in Mandatory Palestine, and educated at the University of London, where he studied economic history. He was not an Assyriologist by formal credential. He was, however, one of relatively few 20th century writers on Sumerian material who learned to read cuneiform himself rather than relying exclusively on published translations. His knowledge of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Akkadian, and his self-directed work in Sumerian allowed him to compare lines of the Enuma Elish directly against the standard scholarly editions, including those of Langdon and the earlier Assyriological literature. In 1976, he published The 12th Planet, the first book in what became the Earth Chronicles series. The central argument of that book, and the part that concerns us here, is an extended, close reading of the Enuma Elish, in which Sitchin proposes that the poem describes an astronomical event. He argues, line by line, that the figures named in the text correspond not to gods in the abstract theological sense, but to specific celestial bodies. Tiamat is a watery planet in an early configuration of the inner solar system. Marduk is an invading body on a long-period orbit. Winds and arrows of lightning that accompany Marduk are satellites, moons or fragments, that strike Tiamat. The splitting of Tiamat into two halves is a physical event. One half becomes what the text calls the hammered bracelet, read, Sitchin's interpretation, as the asteroid belt. The other half becomes Earth, displaced into a new orbit. This is a strong claim. It is also a falsifiable one. If the Enuma Elish is read as Sitchin reads it, then it makes specific predictions about the geometry of the early solar system that should be testable against modern planetary science. Sitchin made several such predictions. He argued that the existence of a long-period planet, not yet catalogued by astronomers, was implied by the text. He argued that the asteroid belt should show signs of having originated from a single broken body. He argued that the obliquity and rotation of certain inner planets bore signatures of an ancient collision event. The methodological move that matters here is not whether Sitchin was right in every detail. It is that he treated the Enuma Elish as a text whose content could, in principle, be checked against the external world. That is a different operation from reading it as a religious poem. It assumes that the people who composed the text were trying to describe something. It assumes that the language of gods was, for them, a language of bodies in the sky. Sitchin is not the only researcher to have made this move. In the early 21st century, the British aerospace engineers Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel took up a related project with a different Mesopotamian artifact, the round clay tablet known as the planisphere, held in room 55 of the British Museum, the same room as several Enuma Elish fragments. The planisphere is divided into 8 segments, Bond and Hempsel published a peer-reviewed monograph through a small academic press in approximately 2008, arguing that the tablet records observations of the night sky on a specific date, the early morning of June 29th, 3123 BCE, and that the observations include the passage of a large object across the constellations later, identified with the impact site at Kofels in the Austrian Alps. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Bond is an aerospace engineer who worked on rocket propulsion systems and led development of the Sabre engine at Reaction Engines Limited. Hempsell is a spacecraft systems engineer who held academic positions in the United Kingdom and consulted for the European Space Agency. Their argument is not that the planisphere is a creation myth. It is that the tablet is what it appears to be, an observational record made by people watching the sky and noting what they saw on a specific night. The methodology in both cases, Sitchin's reading of the Enuma Elish, Bond and Hempsell's reading of the planisphere, follows the same logic. Take the text as the people who made it appear to have meant it. Identify the geometric and astronomical claims it contains. Check those claims against what modern science can reconstruct of the relevant ancient sky. The finding when this method is applied to the Enuma Elish is the one already stated. The poem describes an impact event in which one body in the sky is broken into two, with the pieces redistributed into new positions. The same essential geometry, one body broken by the action of another, fragments scattered, the sky after the event not as the sky before, appears in 4 other Asian texts compiled at different times in different places by people who, on the conventional view of ancient communication, could not have been talking to one another. The Rigveda's Indra hymn describes the storm god opening the body of the dragon Vritra and releasing what had been held inside. Huainanzi's account of Nuwa describes a pillar of heaven broken and a sky repaired. Samguk Yusa's account of Dangun ties the founding of the Korean state to a heavenly descent at a precise date. The Takenouchi tradition describes, in much later codification, an ancient celestial parent figure split in a primordial event. None of these texts on the alternative reading borrowing from the Sumerian. The dates are too widely separated. The languages are unrelated. The cultures had, in the relevant centuries, no overland or maritime routes that could plausibly carry a detailed astronomical narrative from Mesopotamia to East Asia. Yet, the underlying geometric structure of the 4 accounts is, on close reading, the same. If the alternative reading is substantially correct, consequences for conventional history are considerable. The first is the simplest. It would mean that the Enuma Elish is not a creation myth in the symbolic sense, but a record. The category to which the text belongs would shift in the academic taxonomy from religious poetry to observational tradition. That is not a small change. It would affect how the text is taught in graduate seminars in Assyriology, how it is cited in works on the history of religion, and how the field of comparative mythology treats Mesopotamian material in relation to other ancient cosmologies. The second consequence concerns the dating of the underlying tradition. The surviving Enuma Elish tablets are physical objects of approximately 700 BCE. The composition is dated to the 2nd millennium BCE on linguistic and stylistic grounds. But if the text records an actual event, the event itself must be at least as old as the earliest memory of it, and the memory must have been preserved with sufficient fidelity for the geometric structure to survive into the written form. That implies an oral tradition stretching back, on the conventional view of Sumerian civilization, to a period before written records, into the late 4th millennium BCE or earlier. Third consequence is geographic. The same event, if it was real, would have been observable from a wide area of the Earth's surface. 4 other Asian traditions that appear to record it, Vedic, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, are spread across an arc of more than 7,000 kilometers from the Indus Plain to the Japanese archipelago. If they all witness the same celestial event, the event must have been visible across that arc. That places it in the upper atmosphere or in space, not as a local impact. It would have been a sky event seen by everyone whose night was clear when it happened. Fourth consequence is methodological. It would mean that the standard academic strategy of treating cross-cultural parallels as the product of the diffusion or coincidence is in this case inadequate. Diffusion across the Eurasian landmass in the relevant period cannot easily account for the geometric specificity of the parallel. Coincidence, independent invention of the same image, does not account for the precision of the shared structure. A third explanation is required. Common witness to a real event is one such explanation. There are others, but the burden falls on whichever explanation is offered to account for the specifics. The fifth consequence concerns the Korean date in particular. The Samguk Yusa, compiled by Iryeon around 1281 in the late Goryeo period, places the founding of Gojoseon under Dangun at 2333 BCE. This date is, in modern South Korean civic life, the basis of the traditional Korean calendar, in which the current year is calculated by adding 2333 to the Gregorian year. The mainstream historical view is that this date is a medieval calculation, not a historical record, but if it is read as a memory rather than a calculation, as the alternative reading of related Asian founding texts would suggest is at least possible, then it places a marker at a moment in the early 3rd millennium BCE that aligns, within the imprecision native to ancient dating, the broader window during which several Asian founding traditions cluster. The Indian tradition is more diffuse, but worth examining in detail. The Rigveda was compiled in oral form approximately between 1500 and 1200 BCE, but the events its hymns describe are widely understood to be older. The hymn of Indra and Vritra appears in several variants across the collection. Core image is consistent. Indra wields a weapon called the Vajra, often translated as thunderbolt. He uses it to strike Vritra, described as a serpent or dragon enclosing the waters. When Vritra is split, the waters are released, and the world becomes as it now is. The conventional reading treats this as a monsoon allegory, the storm god releasing the rains. The alternative reading notes that the geometric structure, a body struck, opened, its contents released, the world afterward different, is the same structure that appears in the Enuma Elish. The Chinese tradition presents a parallel image with a different cast of figures. The Huainanzi, compiled at the court of Liuan, the king of Huainan, in the 2nd century BCE, preserves much older material on cosmogonic events. One passage describes a time when the pillars of heaven were broken and the cords of the earth snapped. The sky tilted to the northwest and the earth sank in the southeast. The goddess Nuwa, in response, smelted 5 coloured stones to repair the heavens and cut off the legs of a giant turtle to set up new pillars at the 4 corners. Mainstream reading is that this is a flood myth wrapped in cosmological language. The alternative reading notes the specific detail, the sky tilted, which corresponds to an axial shift, and that the repair narrative implies a pre-existing memory of an undisturbed sky against which the disturbance is registered. The Japanese case is the most contested. The Takenouchi manuscripts surfaced in the early 20th century, brought forward by the priest Takenouchi Kiyomaro, who claimed they had been preserved in his family for many generations. The mainstream Japanese academic view treats them as 20th century compositions, possibly drawing on older oral traditions but unreliable as ancient documents in their own right. The manuscripts describe a sequence of celestial parents and an event in which the cosmic order is disturbed and then restored. The alternative tradition reading does not require the Takenouchi manuscripts to be authentic in the way their proponents claim. It requires only that the underlying motif, a primordial celestial disturbance followed by reordering, be present in the older substrate of Japanese tradition. That substrate is independently attested in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, compiled in 712 and 720 CE respectively, both of which contain accounts of celestial generations and a primordial structuring event. The fourth case, the Korean, has been mentioned. Samguk Yusa places Dangun's founding at 2333 BCE. The chronicle further describes the descent of Huanung, the heavenly figure who is Dangun's father, to the top of Mount Pektu, accompanied by 3,000 followers and 3 heavenly seals. Descent narrative is structurally similar to other Asian and Near Eastern accounts of a celestial event, with terrestrial consequences. Date sits in the early 3rd millennium BCE, in a window that overlaps with the broader chronology of the alternative reading. Quotes. If you want to check these texts against one another, the relevant editions are available in any well-equipped university library. The Rigveda existence in multiple critical editions, including the Aufrecht edition of 1877 and the Van Newton and Holland edition of the early 1990s. The Huainanzi has been translated into English by John Major and his collaborators, and published by Columbia University Press around 2010. The Samguk Yusa has been translated by Hartai Hung and Grafton Mintz, and published by Yonsei University Press in 1972. The Enuma Elish is available in Daly's translation. The reader who wants to test the parallel is not asked to take anyone's word for. The texts are open. The question is what one finds when one reads them side by side. What is found on close reading is that the geometric structure recurs. One body, another body, a break, a redistribution, a sky that is now different from the sky that was. The Vedic version dresses this in storm god imagery. The Chinese version dresses it in pillars and turtles. Japanese version dresses it in generations of celestial parents. The Korean version dresses it in a founding king's descent. Sumerian version dresses it in the marriage of Apsu and Tiamat, and the arrival of Marduk. Strip the costume from each, and the same shape is underneath. The question this raises is not, in the first instance, what the event was. Question is whether the parallel structure across these texts is itself a fact requiring explanation. The mainstream position is that the parallel is either coincidental or thematic, or the product of universal cognitive patterns. The alternative position is that the parallel is specific enough, and the cultures involved isolated enough. Some shared external referent is more economical than coincidence. And the next question, what the referent might have been, is open. If the artifact at the centre of all this is a single tablet in room 55 of the British Museum, the field of inquiry it opens is large. Sumerian text is one anchor among 5. The other 4 anchors are equally available to any scholar willing to read them as observational records, rather than as decorative cosmologies. There is one further implication that deserves direct statement. If the parallel is real, channel by which the memory was preserved must also be real. Oral tradition over 4 millennia is not impossible, but it is rare, for cases in which it has been documented. Indigenous Australian accounts of coastal flooding at the end of the last glacial period, for example, which have been linguistically dated to between 7,000 and 10,000 years of continuous transmission, are exceptional and require specific cultural conditions. The 4 Asian civilizations in question are exactly the kind of civilizations that could have sustained such transmission. Each had a continuous priestly or scribal class. Each had a strong tradition of preserving foundational narratives in liturgical form. Each had, at the time of first writing, an existing oral repertoire that the written record was understood to be merely fixing in a more durable medium. The Vedic tradition is the clearest case. The Rigveda was preserved orally for, on the mainstream view, at least 700 years before any written form is attested, and the transmission was so precise that variant readings between recensions are statistically rarer than copying errors in early medieval European manuscripts. The Chinese tradition preserves much earlier material in the form of bronze inscriptions, oracle bones, and quoted fragments in later texts. The Korean tradition, as preserved by Iryeon in 1281, is explicit about its dependence on older sources. Iryeon names earlier chronicles he consulted, some of which no longer survive in independent form. The Japanese tradition, as fixed in 712 and 720 CE, names the oral reciters and the court officials who compiled and transcribed the older material. In each case, the chain of transmission is long, but it is also documented in the texts themselves. This means that the alternative reading does not require an exotic mechanism of memory transfer. It requires only that the existing, well-documented mechanisms, priestly recitation, scribal transcription, liturgical repetition, preserved a particular shared content across cultures. Whether that content was an actual celestial event, or a shared cultural inheritance from a still earlier source common to all 5 traditions or something else, is a further question. What the structural parallel establishes at minimum is that the question is worth asking. What it does not establish is the specific physical event. The leap from parallel to event is a separate move requiring separate evidence. The academic response to Sitchin's reading of the Enuma Elish and to the broader project of treating ancient cosmologies as observational records has been remarkably consistent across the past 50 years. It has been in the main not refutation, it has been characterization. Sitchin is described as an amateur. Credentials are noted as outside the field of Assyriology. The 12th planet is placed in the category of speculative non-fiction. Poe's planet, which he called Nibiru, is dismissed by reference to current astronomical surveys that have not detected such an object. What is rarely engaged with is the specific reading of the Enuma Elish itself. The line-by-line analysis Sitchin offered, in which particular Akkadian terms are tied to particular astronomical bodies, has not been the subject of a published rebuttal in any of the major Assyriological journals. The standard works on the Enuma Elish, Dali's myths from Mesopotamia, Foster's Before the Muses, and the various commentaries by Lambert and others proceed as if the alternative reading does not exist. Sitchin is not cited. Questions he raised are not addressed. The text is read as it was read before, creation poem fit for liturgical use in the Babylonian New Year festival. This is the asymmetry that the forensic reader notices first. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Characterization requires only a label. Sitchin's reading of the 4th tablet of the Enuma Elish, in which Marduk's net, his winds, his arrows, the splitting of Tiamat are mapped onto a sequence of astronomical events, has not been shown to be wrong line by line. It has been claimed, to be the work of someone outside the proper credentialing structure. Those are different operations. Cross-cultural parallels have received similar treatment. The standard academic response to the suggestion that the Vedic, Chinese, Korean, Japanese and Sumerian traditions might preserve a common observational memory is to invoke either diffusion, coincidence, or what is sometimes called the structuralist explanation, that the human mind, presented with sky and earth, and the question of how things came to be, tends to produce similar narratives. Each of these explanations is defensible at the general level. None of them, in the published literature available to a careful reader, been deployed against the specific geometric correspondence of the 4 Asian traditions in any sustained form. There is no peer-reviewed paper that takes the Rigveda's Vritra hymn, the Huainanzi's newer narrative, the Samguk Yusa's Dangun chronology, Takanouchi material, and the Enuma Elish, lays them side by side, and demonstrates with reference to specific lines. The geometric structure of the alleged parallel is either weaker than claimed, or stronger than coincidence would predict. There has been work on each text individually. There has been work on subsets of 2 or 3 of the texts in regional comparative studies: Vedic, Avestan, Chinese with Korean, Sumerian with Hebrew. There has not been a systematic engagement with the full 5-way parallel that the alternative reading proposes. The same pattern repeats in the case of the planisphere of Nineveh. Bond and Hempsel's monograph, published in approximately 2008, has not been refuted in any peer-reviewed Assyriological journal. The astronomical claim that the tablet records a specific date and a specific celestial passage is testable. The authors made the calculation transparent. Their software is available. The data they used is the standard astronomical data available to any researcher. The response was essentially silence, followed by dismissal in popular reviews. No counter-calculation has been published, showing that the astronomical alignment they describe does not in fact obtain for the date they specify. This is the form of dismissal that the alternative tradition audience recognizes and resents. It is not that the establishment has examined the specific calculation and found it wanting. It is that the specific calculation has not been examined, and the conclusion has nonetheless been delivered. Pattern is familiar from other cases. Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist, written extensively on the institutional reluctance to engage with anomalous data in his own field. The structural problem he describes: that academia prefers low-risk incremental work over high-risk engagement with claims that would, substantiated, require revision of major frameworks, applies in modified form to the case at hand. The mainstream Assyriological community is not, in any individual sense, dishonest. The scholars who work on these texts are careful, learned, and sincere. The problem is structural. There is no professional incentive for a tenured Assyriologist to publish a careful rebuttal of Sitchin's reading of the Enuma Elish. The exercise would not advance the rebutting scholar's career. It would, in many subfields, be treated as a waste of expertise. The result is that the question goes unanswered, not because the answer is obvious, but because the answer is not professionally rewarded. A form of dismissal, then, is silence at the level of journal publication, characterization at the level of popular and semi-popular communication. Sitchin is mentioned when he is mentioned, fringe figure whose work need not be engaged with in detail. Bond and Hempsel are mentioned when they are mentioned as a curiosity. Cross-cultural parallels are noted when they are noted, as the kind of thing that the credulous find compelling, but that careful scholarship has long ago set aside. What has not happened in any of the standard reference works is the specific exercise of taking the parallel and addressing it. No counter-reading of the geometric structure has been published, showing that the structure is weaker than claimed. No alternative diffusion model has been worked out in detail to account for how 5 widely separated ancient cultures came to encode the same essential image. The question that has not been answered seriously is the question that the forensic reader most wants answered. The asymmetry is in the public record. Anyone can read the texts. Anyone can look up the Assyriological literature and search for engagement with Sitchin's specific reading. Anyone can search for a peer-reviewed counter-calculation to Bond and Hempsel's monograph. Reader who undertakes that exercise will find what the alternative tradition community has been finding for half a century. The engagement that one might expect is not there. A small number of voices within mainstream academia have noted the problem in passing. Some commentators within the comparative study of religion have observed that the discipline has developed an immune response to certain kinds of cross-cultural argument, that the very form of the argument, regardless of its content, triggers a category of rejection. The application of that observation to the present is straightforward. The argument That 5 ancient Asian texts preserve a common observational memory is precisely the kind of argument that the immune response identifies and rejects without close examination. There is one further dimension worth noting: the omission from documentaries. The major television and streaming presentations of Mesopotamian civilization over the past 3 decades have treated the Enuma Elish in the standard mainstream framing. The alternative reading is, when mentioned at all, mentioned in segments devoted to popular pseudoscience, rather than in the segments devoted to the text itself. The viewer who encounters the Enuma Elish in such a documentary does not learn that there is a serious alternative reading with a substantial publication history. The viewer learns that there is a mainstream interpretation and that some people believe other things which are not worth detailed presentation. The result is a closed loop. The mainstream interpretation is the only one presented in accessible popular form. The alternative reading is not engaged with in the academic literature. The two communities, mainstream and alternative, do not meet. Questions that would clarify the disagreement. The questions about specific lines and specific calculations are not asked in any forum where both communities are present and accountable to one another. This is the asymmetry. It is not a conspiracy. It is an institutional pattern. Pattern produces the same outcome as a conspiracy would produce. The specific claims of the alternative reading are not addressed, without anyone in particular having intended that outcome. Recognizing the pattern draws the appropriate conclusion. Question of the Enuma Elish as an observational record remains open, not because it has been settled, but because it has been declined. To understand what is at stake in the Enuma Elish reading, it helps to spend time in the world that produced the text. Sumer in the 3rd millennium BCE was a network of city-states across the southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, the cities Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish were close together by modern standards, often within a day's walk of one another, and they were linked by canals that doubled as roads and as the irrigation infrastructure that made the agriculture of the region possible. The economy was barley and dates, sheep and goats, fish from the marshes, trade goods, carried up and down the rivers in reed boats. The cities were dominated by temples. Each city had its principal deity, housed in a ziggurat, a stepped pyramidal structure that served as the god's earthly residence. Nippur was the city of Enlil, lord of the air. Eridu was the city of Enki, lord of the freshwater abyss. Uruk was the city of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Babylon, when it rose in the early 2nd millennium BCE, became the city of Marduk. And it was in the priestly tradition of Marduk's temple, the Esagila, that the Enuma Elish was composed in the form it has come down to us. The temple was not merely a religious institution, the economic and administrative centre of the city. It owned land, employed scribes, maintained granaries, managed irrigation, conducted the rituals on which, in the Sumerian worldview, the prosperity of the city depended. The scribal class attached to the temple was a small, hereditary, highly literate group. Boys were trained in the tablet house, the Idabba, from the age of about 7, in a curriculum that combined cuneiform writing, mathematics, music, and the recitation of literary and religious texts. Training was rigorous. The surviving school texts show students copying out lines, calculating areas, listing the names of stars and gods and trees and birds, and producing miniature versions of the great literary works. Among the texts the scribes copied was the Enuma Elish. The composition is preserved in copies from many cities, over many centuries. The Ashurbanipal library copies are the most complete, but earlier copies exist from Babylon, from Ashur, and from the great Mesopotamian temple cities. The text was central to the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year, which took place in the spring at the time of the equinox. During the festival, the king of Babylon was ritually stripped of his insignia, struck on the cheek by the high priest, made to confess his failings, and then restored to his office. The Enuma Elish was recited during this period. The audience, at least the audience that mattered for the political function of the festival, was the king, the priesthood, and the gods themselves, who were understood to be listening. What the recitation accomplished in the Sumerian and Babylonian understanding was a renewal of the cosmic order. The world had been made through Marduk's victory over Tiamat. The annual recitation reenacted that victory and ensured that the order it established would continue for another year. The text was, in this sense, performative. It did not merely describe the creation, it perpetuated it. This is the conventional reading at its strongest. It is coherent. It is documented in the Babylonian liturgical record. It accounts for the social function of the text in the place and time where it was used, and it has nothing in it that contradicts the alternative reading. The two readings address different questions. The conventional reading asks what the text did. The alternative reading asks what the text said. The world in which the text was used was one in which the night sky was a subject of intense and continuous attention. The Mesopotamian scribes maintained astronomical records over centuries. The standard Mesopotamian star catalogue of the late 2nd millennium BCE lists constellations, planetary motions, the seasons of stellar visibility, timing of solstices and equinoxes. The Babylonian astronomers were the first known group of humans to track planetary positions systematically over long periods. Their records, preserved in the diary tablets from the late Babylonian period, extend back over centuries with sufficient precision that modern astronomers have used them to refine measurements of changes in the length of the day over the past 2.5 millennia. The people who recited the Enuma Elish, in other words, knew the sky. They had professional astronomers in their temples. They had a vocabulary for celestial bodies and for celestial events. They had a method for distinguishing between the regular and the irregular in the sky. They had, for centuries before the surviving copies of the Enuma Elish were inscribed, the capacity to record observations of unusual phenomena. The argument that such a culture would have preserved, in its most central liturgical text, only an abstract creation poem with no observational content is not an absurd argument. But it is also not a self-evident one. The opposite possibility, that the central liturgical text encoded a real observational tradition dressed in the language of the gods, because that was the language available, is at least as worthy of consideration. The other 4 Asian civilizations, whose texts parallel the Sumerian, had similar professional classes attentive to the sky. Vedic priesthood maintained the sophisticated calendar and ritual cycles of the Indian subcontinent. Chinese imperial bureaucracy, from the Shang period onward, employed court astronomers whose records of eclipses, comets, and unusual celestial phenomena extend across more than 3,000 years and constitute, by some measures, the longest continuous astronomical record produced by any human civilization. The Korean court, by the Three Kingdoms period, and certainly by the time of Iryeon's compilation in 1281, had inherited and extended the Chinese astronomical tradition. The Japanese court, by the time of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki in 712 and 720 CE, had access to both Chinese and Korean astronomical scholarship. Each of the 5 civilizations, then, had within its cultural inheritance the capacity to observe, record, and preserve information about the sky. The shared geometric structure in their foundational narratives is therefore not the kind of thing one would expect from cultures that were inattentive to celestial phenomena. It is the kind of thing one would expect from cultures that were attentive to such phenomena and that were attempting to preserve, in their highest status texts, what they understood to be the most important things they knew. Biographies of the figures who preserved and transmitted these texts are themselves worth knowing. Iryeon compiled the Samguk Yusa around 1281, was a Seon Buddhist monk who lived through the Mongol invasions of Korea and who spent the 8th and 9th decades of his life gathering material from older Korean chronicles, many of which have not survived independently. He was a careful compiler who marked his sources where he could and indicated when he was uncertain. The Samguk Yusa is not a credulous work. It is the work of a learned monk attempting to preserve what he could of the older traditions of his country, in a period when those traditions were under pressure from foreign occupation and from the increasing dominance of Chinese-derived models of historiography. Sin Chai-ho, the early 20th century Korean historian, who wrote extensively on Dangun and on the prehistory of the Korean peninsula, born in 1880 in South Chungcheong province, and died in a Japanese prison in 1936. He was an independence activist as well as a historian, and his writings on the antiquity of Korean civilization were partly a response to the Japanese colonial project of treating Korea as a peripheral and derivative culture. His scholarship is contested in detail, but his core insistence that the Korean tradition preserved memories older than the Chinese chronological framework allowed is taken seriously by some contemporary Korean historians of religion and is rejected by others. The composition of the Rigveda was, in the Indian tradition, the work of a class of priestly poets called the Rishis. Names are preserved in the headings of individual hymns. The transmission was oral, by a method that built in redundancy at the level of word, syllable, and phoneme. The result, by the time the text was first written down in the medieval period, was a degree of textual stability that modern philologists describe as remarkable. The Rigveda is, in the sense that matters here, fossil of late Bronze Age Indian religious thought, preserved through a transmission mechanism more reliable than most ancient manuscript traditions. The Huainanzi was compiled at the court of Liu An, Prince of Huainan in the 2nd century BCE. Liu An gathered scholars from multiple traditions at his court and produced a synthetic encyclopedia of contemporary knowledge. Compilation drew on much older sources, including some that no longer survive independently. The cosmological sections, in particular, preserve material that scholars have argued is significantly older than the 2nd century compilation date, drawing on traditions that may go back to the early Zhou period or earlier. The Takanouchi manuscripts, as has been noted, are textually problematic. Their attested existence dates only to the early 20th century. The Japanese substrate they claim to preserve, however, independently attested in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. The Kojiki was compiled by O no Yasumaro in 712 CE on the basis of the oral recitations of a court official named Hieda no A. The Nihon Shoki was compiled by a different commission a few years later, in 720 CE. Both works draw on older oral traditions whose precise antiquity is impossible to establish, but which, by the testimony of the compilers themselves, extended back many generations before the time of compilation. The point of these biographical notes is simple. The transmission of each of these texts is a documented historical process involving named individuals working in documented institutional settings. Texts did not appear from nowhere. They were preserved by people whose work, by the standards of their own time and culture, careful and high status, treating their work as the result of mere fancy, or as the symptom of universal cognitive patterns alone, was a strong claim. It requires evidence at least as strong as the evidence the alternative reading offers. Cosmological frameworks of the 5 traditions deserve a moment of attention. The Sumerian framework treated the sky as a layered structure of heavens above a flat or slightly domed earth, the gods occupying specific celestial regions, and the planets being the visible manifestations of those gods. Vedic framework treated the sky as the abode of the Adityas, the solar deities, conceived of cosmic events as the actions of the storm and sun gods. The Chinese framework treated the heavens as a domed canopy supported by pillars and viewed irregular celestial events as omens of imperial favour or disfavour. The Korean framework absorbed the Chinese cosmological vocabulary but retained, in its founding narratives, traces of an older shamanistic celestial cosmology centred on Mount Paektu. The Japanese framework treated the upper world as a realm of kami, divine presences, who could descend and ascend along specific celestial pathways. These frameworks are different. Their gods are different. Their narrative furniture is different. What is the same, across all five, is the structural element that the alternative reading identifies. The encoding in foundational text, an event in which one celestial body is broken by the action of another. And the world afterward is different from the world before. There is one further dimension to the Sumerian context that bears on the reading. The Sumerian language is, in its known form, a linguistic isolate. Unrelated to any other documented language family, it survives as a written tradition long after it ceased to be a spoken language, preserved in the temple schools. As Latin was preserved in medieval Europe, the Akkadian language Enuma Elish is therefore at one remove from the underlying Sumerian sources. Some of the figures in the poem Apsu, Tiamat, Anshar, Kishar have Sumerian linguistic roots that point back to a tradition older than the Akkadian form of the text. The composition is, in the technical philological sense, a stratified document with layers of different ages. The deepest layer, the one that names the primordial figures and describes their initial conditions, may be older than any written form. The scribes who copied the Enuma Elish in the 7th century BCE were inheriting material that had passed through Akkadian, through Old Babylonian, and ultimately back through a Sumerian substrate, whose own age is difficult to fix. Question the alternative reading raises: whether the geometric content of the celestial battle was already present in the deepest stratum is a question about a tradition whose total duration may exceed 3,000 years. That is not a comfortable time scale for the conventional reading. Poem composed in the 2nd millennium BCE and copied for liturgical use over 1,000 years is one thing. Tradition, whose underlying content predates the invention of writing and was transmitted orally through cultures, languages, political successions for an additional 1,000 years is something else. The conventional reading does not require this scale of antiquity. The alternative reading does. The tablet is about 14 centimetres across. It fits in one hand. It has been in room 55 of the British Museum since the late 19th century. Text it carries has been read for 150 years by scholars working in Akkadian and Sumerian, the reading that places its central event in the same category as parallel events. In 4 other Asian textual traditions is available to any scholar wants to undertake the work. The question is open. The deepest of the 4 cross-cultural parallels is the Vedic. Rigveda is the oldest of the 4 Vedas, the foundational scriptures of what would become the Hindu tradition. It contains 1,028 hymns in 10 books, composed in an archaic form of Sanskrit, and addressed primarily to the deities of the Vedic pantheon: Indra, Agni, Soma, Varuna, the Maruts, the Adityas, and others. The text was preserved orally for at least 7 centuries before being written down. The Rigveda is, by most measures, the oldest continuously transmitted religious text in the world. The hymn at the centre of the present comparison is the Indra Vritra hymn, found in several forms across the collection, but most fully developed in the first book. The story is this: the serpent Vritra, whose name means the one who encloses or the one who restrains, has wound himself around the cosmic waters, holding them captive. Indra, the storm god, takes up his weapon, the Vajra, often translated as thunderbolt or as adamantine bolt. He confronts Vritra. He strikes him with the Vajra. He cleaves the serpent's body open. The waters that had been held captive rush forth. The world receives the rains. Mountains stand firm. The sun is set in its course. The order of things, as it now exists, comes into being. The conventional reading of this hymn is straightforward. It is a monsoon myth, an Indo-European storm god myth with parallels in Greek Zeus and Typhon, in Hittite Teshub and Iluyanka, and in Norse Thor and Jormungandr. The widespread distribution of the storm god defeats serpent narrative across Indo-European cultures is taken as evidence of a common Proto-Indo-European mythological substrate, with each daughter culture preserving a variant of the inherited story. This is a defensible reading, but the geometric structure shared with the Enuma Elish is more specific than the general Indo-European pattern. Vritra is described as enclosing the waters in a body that, when split, releases what was contained. Tiamat is described as a watery body that, when split, releases what was contained, half becoming the sky waters above and half becoming the earth waters below. The image of a body that contains something which is released by a splitting action is precise. The Indo-European parallels in Greek, Hittite, Norse traditions involve a defeat of a monster, but not, in the same precise way, release of contained substance through a structural splitting. The Chinese parallel is preserved most clearly in the Huainanzi, in a passage describing the breaking of the pillars of heaven. The figure who attempts the repair is Nuwa, often depicted in later iconography, with a serpent's body and a human upper half. The sky has tilted to the northwest, because one of its supporting pillars has broken, has sunk in the southeast, because one of its supporting cords has snapped. The waters of the great flood rush in. Nuwa smelts 5 coloured stones to patch the heavens. She cuts off the legs of a giant turtle to set up new pillars. The order of the world is restored, but it is not what it was before. The sky, after the event, tilts. The sun and moon, in their courses, slope westward. The rivers, in their flow, run east. The conventional reading of this passage is that it is a Chinese cosmogonic narrative addressing the universal human anxiety about the stability of the heavens. It is grouped, in standard scholarship, with the many flood narratives of the ancient world and with the various pillar of heaven motifs found across cultures. The alternative reading notes that the specific element, the sky tilted, the heavenly order altered, post-event world differing from the pre-event world in measurable astronomical ways, corresponds precisely to what one would expect a culture to record if it had witnessed a sudden axial change. Whether the historical Earth has ever undergone such a sudden axial change is a separate scientific question. The geological and paleomagnetic record contains evidence of axial wandering on long timescales, but no consensus support for a rapid event, kind the alternative reading might suggest. What is in the textual record, regardless of what the geological record says, is the description. Korean parallel, preserved in the Samguk Yusa, compiled by Iryeon around 1281, takes a different form. The Dangun narrative begins with the heavenly figure Huanin, the Lord of Heaven, whose son Huanung desires to descend to the human world. Huan grants Huanung the 3 heavenly seals and sends him down to Mount Paktu, accompanied by 3,000 followers. Huanung establishes a city at the foot of a sacred tree and rules over wind, rain, and clouds. A bear and a tiger pray to become human. The bear endures the prescribed trial and becomes a woman. Huanung takes her as his wife. Their son is Dangun. Dangon founds Gojoseon, first Korean state, in the year 2333 BCE. The conventional reading is that this is a much later medieval composition assembled by Iryeon from a combination of older oral sources and Buddhist, Chinese chronological frameworks. The 2333 date is treated as a back calculation, not a historical record. Descent narrative is treated as a foundational myth in the standard sense, designed to establish the divine legitimacy of the Korean royal line. The alternative reading does not require Dangon to be a historical figure. It requires only that the elements of the narrative, a celestial figure descending to a specific terrestrial location at a specific date, accompanied by a numbered company and bearing items called heavenly seals, preserve a memory whose structure parallels the other Asian celestial narratives. The descent at the date 2333 BCE places the event in the same broad third millennium window, in which broader chronology of the alternative reading clusters. The Japanese material is the most difficult of the four and must be handled with care. Takenouchi manuscripts, brought forward in the early 20th century by Takenouchi Kiyomaru, generally regarded by mainstream Japanese scholarship as compositions of recent date that draw on older traditions, but cannot be relied upon as ancient documents. The alternative reading should not stake itself on the authenticity of the Takenouchi material as such. The relevant substrate is in the earlier and undisputed sources, the Kojiki of 712 CE and the Nihon Shoki of 720 CE. In these works, the cosmogonic sequence begins with a primordial generation of celestial pairs, Kunitokotachi and others, followed by the appearance of Izanagi and Izanama, who descend from the heavens by means of a celestial bridge and bring the islands of Japan into being by stirring primordial sea with a jeweled spear. The narrative includes a separation event, the death of Izanami, the descent of Izanagi to the underworld, the eventual separation of the upper and lower realms, that, on the alternative reading, preserves the same essential structure of a primordial unity disturbed, and a post-disturbance world that differs from the pre-disturbance world. These are four parallels, each with its own conventional explanation. The mainstream account treats each as an independent cultural product, whose surface similarities are either coincidental or the result of shared general mythological logic. The alternative reading treats the convergent structure as evidence of a shared referent. The audience is invited to read the text directly and form its own judgment. The translations are available. The originals, for those with the languages, are also available. The question is not closed by anyone's authority. It is closed, if at all, by reading. The strongest published objection to the alternative reading is structural. It is not that any specific element of Sitchin's analysis has been refuted line by line. It is that the analysis as a whole rests on a methodological move that mainstream Assyriology rejects in principle. The move is the treatment of mythological text as observational record. Mainstream scholarship has, over the past 150 years, developed a sophisticated apparatus for distinguishing between texts that record events and texts that perform other functions: liturgical, political, theological, didactic. The Enuma Elish is classified, on every relevant criterion, as a liturgical text. Presumption against reading it as observational record is, therefore, strong, and, on the mainstream view, well-grounded. This is a serious objection. It deserves a serious response. The methodological apparatus mainstream scholarship has developed is the product of generations of careful work. The distinction between record and performance is not arbitrary. There are texts that are clearly records: administrative tablets, treaty documents, year name lists, and there are texts that are clearly performance: hymns, prayers, ritual instructions, The Enuma Elish falls, on the standard criteria, into the second category. To insist on reading it as if it were in the first category requires either a revision of the standard criteria or a demonstration that the standard criteria misclassify this particular text. The alternative reading's response is, in essence, the dichotomy is too sharp. A text can be both performative and observational in origin. A liturgical hymn can encode, in its symbolic language, the memory of an event whose recollection serves the performative function. The Akitu festival recitation of the Enuma Elish was performative. That does not preclude the underlying narrative from having been, in its earliest stratum, an observational tradition. Mainstream and alternative readings are addressing different aspects of the same text. They are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Second serious objection concerns the cross-cultural parallels. The Indo-European storm god defeats serpent narrative is well attested across cultures with documented genealogical relationships. The mainstream view is that the Vedic Vritra hymn belongs in this Indo-European family, not in a deeper Eurasian family that includes Sumerian Tiamat. The genealogical evidence for the Indo-European link is linguistic and structural. The evidence for a deeper Eurasian link, at least at present, is structural alone. Structural evidence without linguistic support is widely held in comparative work to be insufficient. This is also a serious objection. The alternative reading's response is that the structural evidence in the present case is more specific than the general Indo-European storm god pattern, and that the parallel extends to non-Indo-European cultures, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Sumerian, where the linguistic evidence by definition cannot be present. The case is therefore not analogous to the standard Indo-European comparative case. It is a different kind of comparison, requiring different evidentiary standards. A third objection deserves mention. It concerns the question of how, in the absence of writing, an observational tradition could be preserved with the geometric fidelity the alternative reading requires. The mainstream view is that preliterate oral transmission, over the kind of timescale at issue here, is unlikely to preserve specific astronomical detail. Drift is the rule. Specifics blur. By the time an oral tradition reaches written form a millennium or more after the event, what survives is general theme, not particular geometry. This is again a serious objection. It is also one for which counter-evidence exists. Work on indigenous Australian coastal flooding narratives has demonstrated, in peer-reviewed publications in the early 21st century, that specific geographic features, the locations of submerged former coastlines, the names and relative positions of islands, now lost to sea level rise, can be preserved orally with measurable accuracy across approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years. The Vedic tradition's preservation of pre-classical Sanskrit, grammatical and prosodic detail across at least 3,000 years of oral transmission constitutes another body of counter-evidence. Long-duration oral preservation of specific content is unusual but not impossible. The conditions under which it occurs, formal recitation, hereditary transmission, sacralized status of the text, are precisely the conditions present in each of the 5 Asian traditions under consideration. The current state of the debate is that these objections have not been published in a form that explicitly engages with the alternative reading. They are the objections one infers from the standard methodological commitments of mainstream Assyriology and comparative mythology. They have not been deployed in print against Sitchin or against the broader project. The matter therefore remains genuinely unresolved. But there is a mainstream position that has not been argued against the alternative reading in detail. There is an alternative reading that has not been argued against the mainstream position in the venues where mainstream scholars publish. two positions exist in parallel, rather than in dialogue. If the alternative reading is substantially correct, the revisions to conventional history would be specific and significant. The Enuma Elish would need to be reclassified in standard reference works, from creation poem to layered text with an observational substrate. The conventional dating of the underlying Sumerian tradition would need to be pushed back, perhaps significantly, to accommodate a transmission timescale long enough for a real event to have entered the oral tradition. The map of cultural contact across the ancient Eurasian landmass would need to be redrawn to allow for either much earlier diffusion than is currently accepted, or for independent witness to a single celestial event across a wide geographic range. The implications for adjacent unresolved questions are also worth stating. The astronomical evidence for sudden shifts in Earth's obliquity or rotational axis is at present sparse. Textual tradition, pointing to such an event, if taken seriously, would direct investigative attention toward periods and indicators that mainstream geology has had no particular reason to scrutinize. The catalogue of ancient impact events would be reopened to include candidates that the current catalogue treats as having no human witness record. The interpretation of foundational dates in several Asian traditions, the Korean 2333 BCE, the Vedic chronologies, the Chinese cosmological calendars, would acquire new weight as potentially historical markers rather than back-calculated approximations. These are large changes. They are not changes the alternative reading insists upon. They are changes that would follow if the reading were established. The reading has not been established. The artifact is real. Published sources are real. The question is real. The question remains open. The tablet is in room 55 of the British Museum. The other tablets that complete the Enuma Elish are in adjacent cases. The Rigveda is in any university library with a Sanskrit collection. Huainanzi is in any university library with a sinological collection. The Samguk Yusa is in the Kyujangak Institute in Seoul and in translation through Yonsei University Press. Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are in the standard Japanese collections and in English translation through several scholarly presses. Zakaria Sitchin published his reading of the Enuma Elish in 1976. He died in 2010. The reading has been characterized but not refuted line by line in any peer-reviewed venue. Bond and Hempsell published their reading of the planisphere of Nineveh in approximately 2008. Counter-calculation has been published. What the people who composed these texts believed they were recording, and what was actually happening in the sky when the Sumerian poets wrote down the splitting of Tiamat, is still open. It has been open since Leazwa workers first dug the tablets out of the buried library at Nineveh in the 1850s. It is still open now.